The Secrets of Darkhall Manor. Chapter 1. Nightfall over Darkhall. Henry Nightmare, more commonly known as Mr. Nightmare in the world of the supernatural, was a seasoned paranormal investigator. His office in downtown Rye often buzzed with clients, seeking help for anything from misplaced objects to phantom poltergeists. One evening, as the sun started sinking and the shadows of twilight began their dance, a letter arrived. The envelope, crisp and ivory, held a message filled with desperation and fear. The sender, a young woman named Eliza Darkhall, pleaded for his assistance. Eliza was the sole inhabitant of Darkhall Manor, a sprawling estate nestled in the outskirts of Rye, and she believed that she was not alone. Her story chilled Nightmare's bones. She spoke of strange whispers in the night, of unseen hands that moved objects, of icy breaths on the nape of her neck. However, what terrified her the most was the inexplicable absence of her secret lover, who had vanished without a trace. Haunted houses were nothing new to Nightmare. He had ventured into dozens of them, each one more spine, chilling than the last. Yet there was something about Darkhall Manor that intrigued him. It wasn't just the unseen presence or the missing suitor. It was the aura of gloom that seemed to seep out of Eliza's words. Despite the hour, Nightmare grabbed his trench coat, slinging his worn-out bag filled with his paranormal investigation tools: an IMF meter, a digital voice recorder, a thermal imaging camera, and his old, trusty notebook. As he stepped out into the chilly night, the glow of his office lights faded, leaving him under the cover of a starless sky. His destination was clear: Darkhall Manor. The manor stood as a colossal silhouette against the backdrop of the moonlit night. Its Gothic spires and towers, covered in veils of creeping ivy, rose ominously, casting long, frightening shadows that seemed to dance in the flickering torchlight. The cold wind seemed to carry haunting whispers and moans, as if the very house was alive, watching Nightmare's approach. It was at the entrance of this foreboding manor that Mr. Nightmare stood, filled with a familiar cocktail of dread and excitement. The chilling tales and the eerie aura of the house beckoned him, and as he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, he stepped into the world of the unknown, ready to uncover the secrets hidden within the walls of Darkhall Manor. Chapter 2. The Unseen Presence. Once inside Darkhall Manor, the atmosphere shifted. The cold air inside was heavy with age and dust, an oppressive energy seeming to squeeze the grand entry hall. Eliza, a petite woman with fear in her eyes, met Mr. Nightmare at the door. As they exchanged polite greetings, a cold draft swept through the hall, bringing with it an eerie whisper. A chill ran down Nightmare's spine, but he kept his composure. After all, he was no stranger to the uncanny. As he toured the manor with Eliza, the house seemed to protest their presence. In the library, books flung themselves off the shelves, their pages rustling as they fell. In the dining hall, the chandeliers swung precariously, their crystals tinkling like uneasy laughter. Upstairs, in the guest bedroom, the mirror on the wall shivered and fogged, as if someone was breathing on the other side. During his initial walkthrough, Nightmare noted down each bizarre incident in his trusty notebook, his mind racing to put the pieces together. He also used his digital voice recorder to catch any possible electronic voice phenomena. EV. Strange whispers or words captured in the background of recordings that weren't audible during the recording process itself. All the while, Eliza stayed close to him, her fear evident in her tightened grip on her shawl. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, her tales of the unseen presence began to paint a daunting picture. Night had fully descended upon Darkhall Manor when they finally retired to the drawing room. The room was grand, lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors and furnished with antique furniture that had seen better days. Eliza excused herself, leaving Nightmare alone in the room. As he scanned the room with his EMF meter, he could feel an unseen force watching him. It was as if the very air was waiting, holding its breath. Just as Nightmare decided to call it a night, a chill ran down his spine. A photograph on the mantelpiece suddenly flew off, shattering against the stone floor. A hollow echo filled the room, followed by a haunting whisper, "Beware." The first night at Darkhall Manor had ended, leaving behind an unsettling aura and the unseen presence looming over Nightmare. As he retired to his room, he couldn't shake off the feeling of the watching eyes. Unseen, but always present. Chapter 3: The Phantom Suitor. The following day broke with a muted sunlight filtering through the heavy storm clouds that hung over Darkhall Manor. Having had a restless night, Mr. Nightmare arose early, feeling the weight of the task at hand. After a brief breakfast with a visibly tired Eliza, he decided to focus his investigations on the mysterious case of her missing suitor. Eliza's suitor, whom she only referred to as Edward, had been a comforting presence in her life, even if he was a distant one. He was a lover she'd never met in person. He communicated solely through love letters and gifts, his warm words soothing Eliza in her isolated existence. Nightmare requested to see Edward's letters and the gifts he had sent. Eliza hesitantly led him to her room, a quaint chamber that was strangely warmer than the rest of the house. There, in a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, lay the keepsakes of a phantom lover. Letters scrawled in elegant handwriting, filled with words of longing and affection, and small trinkets. A locket, a handkerchief, a single red rose preserved in a glass dome. As he held the letters in his hand, Nightmare couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He began to scan the letters with a UV light, hoping to find some hidden message or clue. To his surprise, the letters held a strange secret. Under the UV light, some letters glowed brighter than others, spelling out, "I'm trapped." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candle on the table and leaving them in semi-darkness. From the corner of the room came a low moan, like a sigh of despair, followed by the distinct sound of a man's voice whispering, "Help me." Eliza jumped, clutching onto Nightmare's arm. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Edward's still here. I'm not imagining things." Nightmare nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The phantom suitor had made his presence known, and with that, the mystery of Darkhall Manor deepened, wrapping them in a web of spectral whispers and hidden messages. Chapter 4: Shadows of the Past. Following the eerie encounter in Eliza's room, Mr. Nightmare decided to delve into the history of Darkhall Manor. Every haunted place had its own tale of woe, and he felt certain that Darkhall Manor was no exception. His exploration led him to the manor's dusty archives. The old records, brittle with age and neglect, revealed a tragic tale of love and loss. Many decades ago, a young man named Edward had lived in Darkhall Manor. He was said to have been madly in love with a woman from the neighboring village, much to the displeasure of his controlling mother. When Edward refused to give up his love, his mother locked him in the manor's tower, hoping to sever his connection to the outside world. Unable to bear the torment of separation and imprisonment, Edward had thrown himself from the tower window, meeting a grisly end. His mother, consumed by guilt and grief, shut herself in the manor, slowly losing her mind to herself. Inflicted solitude. After the mother's death, the manor was passed down through generations, and its tragic history was buried beneath the sands of time, until Eliza, the last remaining heir of the Darkhall lineage, returned to inhabit the ancestral home. As Nightmare read the accounts, he could almost feel the residual despair seeping from the pages. The shadow of Edward's doomed love story had lingered in the manor's old stones, casting a gloomy pall over the entire estate. Was it this tortured spirit that was reaching out to Eliza through the letters and spectral whispers? Was the phantom suitor in reality the spirit of the tragic Edward? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Nightmare knew he was getting closer to the heart of the Darkhall mystery, but he was also acutely aware that the manor still had secrets to reveal, shadows of the past that had yet to be uncovered. Chapter 5: Deception and Despair. As the days turned into nights and the investigation deepened, Mr. Nightmare noticed something odd. The spectral disturbances and eerie whispers seemed to be concentrated around Eliza's overbearing and aloof father, Mr. Mortimer Darkhall. Despite his frail appearance, there was a cunning glint in his eye that did not escape Nightmare. Nightmare began to observe Mr. Darkhall more closely, noticing the way his eyes seemed to follow Eliza wherever she went, the way he lingered near her room when he thought no one was watching, and the unusual interest he showed in Eliza's interaction with the phantom suitor. Intrigued, Nightmare decided to confront him one late evening. As Mr. Darkhall sat in the grand library, immersed in his reading, Nightmare approached him with the love letters. His face turned ashen at the sight of them, giving Nightmare the first sign of guilt. "Mr. Darkhall, do you recognize these letters?" Nightmare asked, his tone steady. As expected, Mr. Darkhall feigned ignorance, but the twitching of his fingers told a different tale. Fueled by this suspicion, Nightmare decided to investigate Mr. Darkhall's private quarters. In the dead of the night, he sneaked into the older man's room, only to discover a shocking truth. Hidden away in a drawer was a set of stationery identical to that used by the phantom suitor. More damning was the sight of an unfinished letter addressed to Eliza, the handwriting a chilling match to the letters she'd received. The words, full of longing and affection, echoed the ones that the phantom suitor had supposedly penned. In that moment, Nightmare realized the dreadful truth. Eliza's phantom suitor was not Edward's tormented spirit, but her manipulative father. The spectral disturbances, the secret love letters, the whispers, they were all part of Mr. Darkhall's plan to keep Eliza tethered to the manor, under his control. The realization hit Nightmare like a cold wave, filling him with anger and disbelief. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Nightmare was left to grapple with the magnitude of Mr. Darkhall's deception. The haunted house had transformed into a stage of psychological manipulation, turning a daughter's longing for love into a tool for control. It was a tale of not just ghosts, but humans, whose actions could be far more terrifying. Chapter 6: The Sinister Revelation. Mr. Nightmare couldn't shake off the sickening feeling that had settled in his stomach after unearthing Mr. Darkhall's deception. The truth was more monstrous than any spectral entity he had ever faced. Yet he knew he had to confront this human horrorhead, on for Eliza's sake. Meanwhile, the house seemed to echo his unsettling discovery. The whispers grew louder. The temperature around Mr. Darkhall's quarters dropped significantly, and a spectral figure of a young man started appearing in the corners of the manor, growing bolder with each sighting. The specter appeared to be in anguish, forever trapped within the manor's walls. But unlike the deceptive ghostly suitor, this spirit seemed genuine. Its presence matched the description of Edward, the tragic figure from the manor's past. Nightmare wondered if Edward's spirit was indeed lingering in the manor, perhaps awakened by Mr. Darkhall's manipulations. His own unfulfilled love story and tragic end resonated with the Fox romance that Darkhall had constructed, potentially stirring Edward from his eternal rest. But there was no time to dwell on this, as Nightmare decided it was time to confront Mr. Darkhall. Equipped with the evidence of the letters, he approached the old man in the grand drawing room, the setting sun casting long, menacing shadows across the room. The revelation led to a tense confrontation. Darkhall was cornered, his scheme laid bare. His initial denials grew weaker as Nightmare presented the irrefutable evidence. As the reality of his deception sank in, the spectral disturbances peaked. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, doors slammed shut, and a chilling whisper echoed, "Justice." Darkhall crumbled under the weight of his deceit, admitting to his manipulation, his twisted logic of protecting Eliza, of keeping her bound to the manor, and himself was nothing short of chilling. But the sinister revelation wasn't over. Just as Nightmare thought he had unearthed all the manor's secrets, the spectral figure of Edward made its appearance, his eyes filled with sorrow, locked onto the shaking figure of Mr. Darkhall. The real haunting of Darkhall Manor was just beginning. Chapter 7: Ghostly Retribution. The revelation of Mr. Darkhall's deception sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the manor. Eliza, who'd been kept in the dark about her father's manipulations, was utterly heartbroken. The ghostly suitor she had grown to love was nothing but a vile lie, a puppet of her father's control. As Eliza retreated into her shell, Mr. Nightmare found himself dealing with an angry, restless spirit. Edward's spectral figure became a constant presence in the manor, his sorrowful eyes often fixed on Mr. Darkhall, who was now a pitiful figure of guilt and fear. Nightmare knew he had to help Edward find peace, to somehow right the wrong that had been done. His initial plan was to have Mr. Darkhall confess his deeds to Edward, in hopes that the admission of guilt would ease the restless spirit. But the old man was too paralyzed by fear, his guilt consuming him. As days turned into nights, Edward's unrest grew. Objects would fly off shelves. Spectral whispers turned into tormented wails, and his spectral figure started appearing more solid, more real. It was clear that Edward sought justice, a closure that seemed out of reach. Just when Nightmare thought the situation couldn't get any worse, an unexpected turn of events took place. One stormy night, Mr. Darkhall, driven by fear and guilt, climbed up the manor's tower, the same tower where Edward had met his tragic end. And in an ironic twist of fate, Darkhall plunged to his death, a fall mirroring Edward's own demise. The news of Darkhall's death filled the manor with an eerie silence. Eliza, despite the betrayal, was shattered by her father's abrupt end. Yet, in the midst of this gloom, a peculiar calm descended upon the manor. The spectral disturbances ceased. The temperature returned to normal, and Edward's spirit was no longer seen. It seemed as if Mr. Darkhall's death had somehow given Edward the closure he had been seeking. His spirit, once trapped in the anguish of his past, had found liberation in the echo of his own fate. As the sun rose over Darkhall Manor, Mr. Nightmare couldn't help but reflect on the chilling tale that had unfolded. The tale of a human's manipulation, a spirit's unrest, and an eerie retribution that transcended the realm of the living. Chapter 8: Echoes of Solitude. The weeks following Mr. Darkhall's demise were filled with a strange stillness. The gloomy shadows that had once clung to the walls of Darkhall Manor seemed to lift, replaced by a semblance of peace that hadn't been felt in a long time. Eliza, despite her grief and sense of betrayal, started to emerge from her shell. The revelation about her phantom suitor and her father's tragic end had been a hard blow, but she was determined to find her own footing, free from the specter of manipulation. Mr. Nightmare, on his part, made sure Eliza was provided with the necessary support and resources. He contacted a therapist to help her cope with the traumatic events, and even enlisted the help of a local historian to help preserve the history of Darkhall Manor, a history that should no longer be buried. As the spectral disturbances ceased, Nightmare decided to wrap up his investigation. Before leaving, he visited the tower where both Edward and Mr. Darkhall had met their tragic ends. A sense of solemnity hung in the air as he looked out of the window. the view showcasing the sprawling manor grounds and the village beyond. Edward's spirit may have found peace, but his story was a grim reminder of the destructive power of control and isolation. It was a tale that Nightmare knew he would carry with him for a long time. As he packed his equipment and prepared to leave Darkhall Manor, he couldn't help but reflect on his own role. He was more than just a paranormal investigator, he realized. He was a listener, a mediator between the living and the dead, a seeker of truths that often lay hidden beneath layers of human and spectral deception. As he drove away from Darkhall Manor, the grand structure receding in his rearview mirror, he couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholic satisfaction. The mystery of the phantom suitor had been solved, the true haunting of the manor uncovered, and a restless spirit had found its peace. And thus ended the eerie tale of Darkhall Manor, leaving behind echoes of solitude, whispers of a doomed romance, and a chilling reminder of the horrors that could stem from control and deception. Thank you for listening to this story till the end. We are still experimenting with this format, so your feedback is highly appreciated. Please give us your feedback by liking or disliking the content. And even better, share your thoughts in the comments, letting us know what you liked and what didn't quite resonate with you. Also, tell us what you would like to hear in the next scary story. You can vote for the comment that suggests an idea you liked the most. We write scary stories based on your requests.